Hello, fiendlings, how the hell are you? Well, it's been an entire week without running water at my house. A tree root shattered a portion of the main line coming into the house, and we started leaking water at a rate of 1.6 gallons a minute. Therefore, we had to shut off the water. I called the water authority, who came and visited and confirmed it was not their problem. They told me to call the plumber. I called the plumber. He told me it was the irrigation line. Call a sprinkler company. I called the sprinkler company. They came out and discovered the leak was beneath a massive tree next to my house. They then told me to call the plumber. This occurred over a series of days before the plumber finally came up with a plan. Rather than removing the tree and digging for days and cost me an absolute fortune, they suggested we run a new water line to the house. So on Tuesday, a fleet of people came to my yard and dug a 75-foot trench for the new line. As one might expect of the Fiendmaster's house, there were great swaths of the front yard festooned with yellow caution tape. I couldn't even get out my front door. So I was ripe because I hadn't showered since the weekend. We were living off of bottled water, and I had to fill up a bucket from the neighbor's yard just to flush the goddamn toilet. Oh, and the pets were living off our stored water supply, which was quickly dwindling. In other words, FML. The plumbers came today and hooked us up within 2 hours of their arrival. I am ready for a shower, dish duty, and clothes washing. Only problem? The cost. The bill is about 1/4 of my annual writing-related income. If that sounds like a lot of money, it is. So if you want to help out with the house repairs, please consider purchasing one of my books from the Zon or one of my audiobooks from Audible. I could really use the help. Now that I've relayed all of this, I need to get back to writing the last words of the new book. Be safe, have a great week, and we'll talk again real soon. Here's episode 13 of The Black Evolution. Chapter 21. They had been studying M2 for 3 days now, and it was officially time to cut bait. They had learned much, but far too little, so they would have to try something else. Shauna's team sat around the table on the lab level. The makeshift meeting room was large enough to house 3 or 4 people comfortably, but with more there, it was getting a little crowded. Neil stood next to the whiteboard, a black marker held before him like a weapon. He'd drawn a grid with the tests and the results. They had poked and prodded the minuscule samples and run the same tests and same routines, but the specimens hadn't reacted to physical stimulation. They'd even tried feeding the samples with biomass, but Moore had terminated the experiments once the samples grew to a size of 5 milliliters. She'd been alarmed by the creature's rapid absorption of nutrients. They had tested 5 possible consumable materials: chicken, carrots, a chunk of sheetrock, a chicken bone, and a cube of construction-grade plastic. Each specimen had torn through the biological offerings with reckless greed. Jay concluded that the porous nature of flesh and bone allowed him to quickly separate the molecules or atoms and absorb the medium. Sounded logical to her. Plastic was consumed too, albeit at a slower rate. The same was true for sheetrock and wood. The only things the creatures didn't seem able to eat were metal and glass, but it weakened those materials. They hadn't had time to study how, and that was the next test. First thing tomorrow. But they were at a standstill on the more important tests. They hadn't been able to recreate the physical characteristics they'd witnessed on Leaguer, nor at the other 2 incident sites. Kate had proposed they start with larger samples, say 5 ml, and torch them if they grew too large. Moore had nixed it and told them to leave the lab and head to the meeting room. And here they were. Moore stood at the end of the folding table, her tablet in front of her. She looked over at the whiteboard, seemingly reacquainting herself with their tests and the results, which Shauna knew was bullshit. She didn't believe for a second that Moore hadn't watched every second of every experiment and knew the results down to the decimal point.
So, no other ideas?
Moore asked.
No,
Kate said.
We're stuck.
Okay, Moore said, and finally sat. She picked up the tablet, tapped it a few times, and put it back down again. Hands folded in front of her, she stared at all and none of them, her eyes finding that perfect balance between the two.
Maybe you're too close to it, she said.
Like anyone here isn't, Jay muttered. Moore's fake smile grew.
I'm not. What do we factually know about the vectors?
Vectors? Neil grinned. You've been spending a lot of time with the CDC? Moore ignored him and glanced at Shauna.
You say that at least 2 workers were infected, is that correct?
She nodded. Best as we figured. I mean, it's possible something else happened, but that's our best guess.
Kate,
Moore asked.
One of our samples got loose and...
Her voice suddenly sounded choked.
Marie was infected. So the facts are, this thing infects, Moore said. At a certain size, it can move across surfaces, and at another size, it begins to extrude appendages and what look like feeding organs.
Looked like, Jay said. Trust me, those things have mandibles. Moore's fake smile dropped away, replaced by a look of reproach.
Be that as it may, she said coldly, those are what you need to test, how it becomes what it becomes. Which means, Kate said, we need larger specimens. No, Shauna said. She means we need test animals. Oh, Kate said. Her skin had turned slightly green. Like mice?
Moore nodded.
Mice, cats, whatever.
Jesus, lady, Jay said. I'm not killing a cat.
I'll call PETA, Moore said. We'll start with a lab rat. I'll get you a few tomorrow. If you need another type of specimen, you'll need to let me know.
The room went quiet. Moore sighed and looked at her watch.
Instead of returning to the lab, I suggest you design your new tests upstairs before dinner. Maybe get something from the commissary? Okay, Kate said. We'll do that.
Moore's shark-like grin reappeared.
Excellent.
She stood, her tablet held in the fingers of her left hand.
You've been working hard. You should be proud of yourselves, she said.
With that, Moore left the room without looking back or waiting for an acknowledgement. She really gives me the creeps, Jay said. Shauna nodded but said nothing in reply. Moore spooked everyone, even Kate. Or maybe, especially Kate.
Well, okay, Kate said. Want to move to the conference room?
No one spoke as they packed up what they had and headed to the elevator. Shauna yawned twice on her way to the dining room. Damn, she was tired. She had finally managed to get some sleep, but it wasn't nearly enough for a long day in the lab. And although she knew they hadn't even put in a full day, it seemed it had gone on forever. But they now knew that separate strains of M2 took on different physical properties under extreme temperature variation. They also knew M2 consumed biological matter better than any other substances they'd tried. And, of course, they knew the light frequency that destroyed M2 completely. In short, they knew a lot, but not enough. Not nearly enough. For instance, how did M2 convert matter into more of itself? Or how about the chemical process of the creatures breaking down matter? Was there a significant lifespan for the spores if they were to land somewhere? Could they infect other creatures? Start at the bottom of the food chain and work their way up? She was pretty sure that was the unspoken question on everyone's mind. And now she guessed that's what Kate would talk about. Fun. More mental gymnastics. Shauna smiled the moment they entered the commissary. Chef Robbie had once again placed large thermoses of hot chocolate on the serving table, along with all the fixings. At least she could get her sugar shock going early. Shauna yawned again and immediately blushed. That one yawn started the entire table going. Jay tried to do an impersonation but couldn't hold it together as his jaws opened wide and gave birth to an ear-splitting howl. Shaking her head at him, Shauna looked back at the board and sipped lukewarm hot chocolate. They had a fair number of biological tests listed, and she knew Neil had pages and pages of experiments he'd wanted to run on the small samples. Since none of the tiny specimens had reacted to stimuli, those had had to be tossed out the proverbial window. Now they were back in play. They had to recalibrate everything to deal with larger entities, maybe something the size of a cat or dog. They had sample cases large enough to house one of the creatures, so that wasn't a problem. The challenge would be keeping themselves safe while performing the tests. The light arrays had been designed for smaller specimens, preventing M2 from escaping the deadly UV rays while ensuring the samples didn't fry. Kate's team would either have to dump the UV lights or find a way to provide enough shade for the samples to survive. Plus, they needed 4 specimens again, 2 each from Poppy and Tob. 4 larger creatures that might be able to transform and eat everyone in the facility if they escaped. That was a very sobering thought. They'd start with lab rats, infect each with a pinpoint worth of M2, observe the gestation period, and measure the resulting creature's volume and physical size. Weighing the rats as accurately as possible to determine their relevant mass would be important to try and establish the creature's transformation processes. It couldn't possibly be 100%. Some of the mass had to be lost to conversion, didn't it? A rap on the door caused Kate to stop mid-sentence. Shauna turned and saw Sarah standing at the threshold. She looked both apologetic and excited at the same time.
Kate, can we borrow your team for a few minutes?
Sure,
Should we bring our drinks? I don't think that's a good idea, Sarah said. Come on. She led them to the elevator, and Shauna's heartbeat picked up. What's going on? Kate asked Sarah. Sarah waved her wristband at the elevator controls and punched the Q button. There's something down in quarantine I need your collective opinion on. She hissed a sigh. And probably your prayers. That stopped everyone in the elevator from talking. It was as if they were holding their breath while they descended deeper into the facility's bowels. Shauna thumbed the metal top of the lighter in her pocket. The spring's ting was almost inaudible. Almost. But as long as she could hear it, she felt calmer. She was glad she kept adding fuel to the lighter every other day. Today might be the day she needed it. The elevator door opened, and a blast of bright UV light made her squint. It took a moment for her eyes to adjust to the painful change in illumination. The sight of 4 men dressed in biosuits, incinerators slung over their shoulders, did nothing to slow her sprinting heart. She continued flipping the top of the lighter, but the sound no longer soothed her. Instead, it sounded like the dripping of black liquid from a frail pipe. As Sarah led them down the hall, Kate continued asking questions, but Sarah continued saying nothing. When they cleared the airlock entrance to the quarantine interior, Sarah turned left and gestured for them to follow. Finally, they reached the containment tanks. Poppy's barrel sat on its side, suspended on a metal stand, pipes leading out of its lid. The heavy glass and steel composite window offered a view into the room. Last night, Sarah said, we had a monitor trip in Poppy's containment system. There were vibrations. Vibrations? That's nothing new, Neil said. What kind of vibrations? She smiled at him, but there was no mirth in it. The big kind. Top's tank nearly rocked in its cradle. So did Poppy's barrel. Silence lingered. Shauna didn't know what to say to that, and even if she did, she wouldn't have tried. Her hands were shaking with fear. What do you want from us? Kate finally asked. Sarah stared at Tobbs' enclosure, the incinerator-armed guards standing at the back wall. A better way to contain them if they burst through their respective metal prisons. You burned them, Shauna said. You fucking burned them. Sarah sighed again. I was asked to get your opinion on what we should do. Dr. Moore made it clear that I was to follow your instructions. Shauna opened her mouth to speak, but Sarah continued talking. So long as it didn't include destroying M2 at this moment. Neil looked horrified. No, we can't destroy it. Not yet. Well, Jay said, how else would we contain it? I don't know, Sarah said, but you might need to come up with a way soon. See that spot? It took a few seconds for her eyes to find it, but sure enough, there it was, just beneath one of the barrel's ribs. Several portions of the metal had been pushed out as though from someone hammering at the inside. The dents were much larger than the ones she'd seen the other day. Jesus wept, Jay said. We have no way of knowing how much steel is left, do we? Sarah shrugged. I have no idea. I'll bet it's thicker, Jay said. It was designed to hold a lot more mass. A sample barrel's not necessarily made for long-term storage. Sarah was silent momentarily, her eyes drifting back to the enclosures. So maybe the tank is thicker. Do you think it will have a more difficult time getting through the steel? I think so, Jay said. We'll know more after we perform the metal tests tomorrow. Metal tests? Sarah asked. Neil brightened. We're going to use larger samples of M2. Should be able to do some biotests and determine how it affects metal and glass, and rate of deterioration, if there is any. Oh, Sarah said. A reluctant smile broke across her face. I guess that's why Moore has me stationed in the lab tomorrow. So you'll be with us? Shauna asked. Yep. That's something at least, Kate said. We'll need to batten down the hatches. I know, Sarah said. I'll do my best to make sure this shit doesn't get out of the lab, like always. Good to know, Shauna said. Okay, that's all I have. Your answer is to either burn it or think about it? Kate and the others glanced at one another. Finally, she said, That's about the size of it. Right, Sarah said, looking more than a little dissatisfied with their answer. I was hoping for a little bit more. Thought maybe you'd have some ideas. We'll discuss it and let you know. Sarah nodded. Don't take too long. Catfish pulled cans of artesian water from the fridge. Shauna sat on the couch, her eyes moodily fixed on the blank television screen. They hadn't spoken much at dinner. They had shared their meal with the rest of the team, where shop talk was all but forbidden, so they hadn't exactly had a chance to catch up. As she told him about her day, the abandonment of the small-scale tests, the plans for the larger specimen biotests, and the containment problem, Catfish began to feel nauseous. It wasn't from the meal or too much caffeine. No, this was fear. When she finished, he stared at her for a long moment, stifling the urge to touch her face. So now what? We torch the facility?
What? No. Well, not yet.
Not yet? Not yet, my ass. If that thing is close to breaking out of its prison. It's not, Shauna said. If it bursts from the barrel, it's going to get nuked by all the UV lights. And if that doesn't stop it, then the incinerators will. He paused for a moment, considering her words. Yes, the creatures were contained in the barrel and storage tank, both encased in the thick glass composite Moore and Kate were so proud of, but it hadn't been tested against M2. Not really. Kate and Moore appeared to accept that the substance would hold up to M2's corrosive nature, but he wasn't convinced. Not at all. Can't say I'm happy to think about any of that. You do realize that the more complicated safety measures are, the more likely they are to fail. She pulled in a shuddering breath before taking a long sip. I've read that book too, and I know that. But if you build enough rings of security, especially making the outer rings pretty formidable, you should be able to keep anything from breaking out. Should. If you're right about these things being from another planet, all bets are off. Well, we should know some things tomorrow, Shauna said. We're going to start with the glass metal tests and see if we can find a rate of deterioration. But you're going to do that after you feed the damn things? She stared at the TV's dead screen for a moment as if the answer to his question lay in its unpowered LEDs. Finally, she nodded. We'll perform the metal and stress tests at the smaller size, and then work our way up once we have the samples grown in the rats. Catfish shivered, the liquid sloshing slightly in the can. And what happens if those get too big? Incineration. We have sample boxes large enough. Shouldn't be a problem. Same as the containment area. If the UV doesn't kill it, fire will. You hope, he said under his breath. How long is all that going to take? Depends. We don't know how fast M2 will grow in the rats. For Krieger, it only took a few hours before she... Shauna broke off. Before whatever happened happened. What happened, Catfish thought, is that the thing absorbed her inside out. In a way, Marie Krieger had fed it, grown it, and birthed it, all against her will. An unwilling host cut down by the substance's insatiable need to feed and live. Like JP, like the other rig workers who became infected, they died without warning, and no one had even really noticed they were that sick. Catfish tried to imagine a hospital filled with hundreds of M2 infected humans, or maybe a mall, or a school. He tapped a finger on the can. You think the infection will be faster in smaller animals? Yep, Shauna said. I mean, it stands to reason that it would go faster. Not as much mass to rewrite or consume or whatever. Well, I guess... He stopped. Did you say rewrite? Shauna paused a moment before finally nodding. Yeah, I did. Explain that. Neil put forth the theory that M2 is rewriting the DNA of the biological cells it encounters, rewriting them to serve itself. Then how does it consume sheetrock, plaster, plastic, and anything that's not biological? And it sure as hell doesn't rewrite dead animal DNA. She slowly smiled. You're so cute when you think you found a hole in a theory. The desperate anger that had welled up from nowhere faded rapidly. He realized he'd been yelling for no reason, and sighed. But it's a hole. Yes, her fingers played with the cuff of his shirt. That's when Jay suggested it's rewriting matter. The thought dangled there for a moment as his mind fought to pluck it and consume it. It was like suggesting that the physical were mere pixels, and all you had to do was rearrange them to create something new and different. How much had Jay been smoking? You mean the crack or the acid? Catfish rolled his eyes. You don't smoke acid, Shauna. Shows you what I know. She brushed his arm. Jay can really think outside the box. Hate that phrase, but you know what I mean. He just tosses this shit out there during brainstorming. Half the time it makes sense. Other times? Her grin brightened. He just sounds nuts. Did he explain how M2 might be rewriting matter? Of course not. He probably thought it was just a neat idea. Catfish finished the can of water, crumpled it, and tossed it to the coffee table. Does sound like a neat idea, he mumbled. She put her dimpled can on the coffee table and curled her legs beneath her. Catfish shuffled and made room as she lay her head on his chest. She dragged one of his arms across her and the other to match. He brushed her cheek with his fingers. You worried about tomorrow? Yes and no. I know we have the best possible defenses if something goes wrong, but I sure as hell don't want something to go wrong.
I know that feeling. Catfish stroked her hair. Think you'll know something definitive tomorrow?
I don't think we will ever find out anything definitive about M2. It just... She paused. Whenever we think we've found a consistent rule, it breaks it. Like the freezing thing. All the samples should have acted the same, but Tob reacted differently and used actual hair to defend itself against the cold. What if it can do the same sort of thing for light?
He felt as though the room had suddenly gotten colder. There were only 3 things they knew that killed M2. Extreme heat, UV light, and fire. If it somehow managed to grow a defense against UV light, it could venture out during the daylight. There would be no natural defense against it at all. That's a terrifying thought.
Yes, it is. And with the 2 samples trying to break out of their confines, we need to find out if that's the case.
Why do you say that?
Because I have a nasty feeling that the larger M2 gets, the more quickly it adapts.
Across the inseam of his jeans.
I'm tired of talking.
Okay. She looked up at him as he stroked her hair.
I want to feel safe for a while.
Catfish turned out the light.